She had grown up with nothing. The kind of nothing that leaves marks on your soul. The kind that makes you swear you'll do whatever it takes to never feel that empty again. Her childhood was a blur of unpaid bills, cold winters without heat, and the constant hum of worry that filled every corner of their tiny apartment. Her mother worked 3 jobs and still couldn't make ends meet. There were nights when dinner was just crackers and tap water, nights when the electricity was shut off and they huddled together under thin blankets, waiting for morning. She remembered the embarrassment of wearing the same clothes to school day after day, the way other kids would whisper and point. She remembered the shame of having her lunch tray taken away because her account was overdrawn. She remembered the fear in her mother's eyes when the landlord came knocking, demanding rent they didn't have. By the time she turned 23, she had made a decision. Love was a luxury she couldn't afford. Security was survival. And when Richard Ashford entered her life, she saw her way out. She saw a door opening to a world she had only ever glimpsed from the outside, a world of comfort and ease and never having to worry about where her next meal would come from. She didn't hesitate. She walked through that door without looking back. Richard was 52, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, and worth more money than she could fathom. They met at a charity gala where she was working as a server, balancing trays of champagne for people who didn't notice her face. She had taken the job through a temp agency, desperate for any work that paid. The ballroom was filled with women in designer gowns and men in tailored suits, all of them laughing and chatting as if the world was theirs to command. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting glittering light across the room. The air smelled of expensive perfume and fresh flowers. She moved through the crowd invisibly, just another servant, careful not to make eye contact, careful not to spill. But Richard noticed. He watched her all evening from across the room, his gaze following her as she moved from guest to guest. She could feel his eyes on her, and it made her nervous. When the event ended and the guests began to leave, he approached her in the empty ballroom. The staff was cleaning up around them, and she was stacking empty glasses on a tray when he stepped in front of her. He introduced himself with a calm smile and handed her a business card. He told her she had grace, poise, qualities he admired. He asked if she would have dinner with him. She looked down at the card, at the embossed lettering that read, Richard Ashford, CEO, Ashford Industries. She knew who he was. Everyone did. He was one of the wealthiest men in the city, a fixture in society pages, a man who moved in circles she could never dream of entering. She said yes, not because she was attracted to him, but because she knew an opportunity when she saw one. Their first dinner was at an exclusive restaurant, where the menu had no prices and the waiters spoke in hushed tones. She wore the nicest dress she owned, a simple black number she had bought at a thrift store, and she felt painfully out of place among the other diners in their designer labels. But Richard didn't seem to notice or care. He asked her about herself, about her life, her dreams. She told him carefully edited versions of the truth. She said she was working to support her mother, that she had always wanted more from life, but had never had the chance. He listened intently, nodding, asking questions. By the end of the evening, she could tell he was interested. Not just in her body, though she suspected that was part of it, but in the idea of her. The young, struggling woman he could rescue, the project he could mold. He called her the next day, and the day after that. Within a week, they were seeing each other regularly. He took her to the theater, to art galleries, to restaurants where reservations had to be made months in advance. He bought her clothes, expensive dresses and shoes that fit perfectly because he had somehow learned her size. He bought her jewelry, delicate pieces that probably cost more than her mother's annual income. She accepted it all with carefully practiced gratitude, playing the role of the grateful recipient, the woman who couldn't believe her luck. And in a way, it wasn't entirely an act. She couldn't believe it was happening. After a lifetime of struggling, of scraping by, suddenly she had access to everything she had ever wanted. Within 3 months, they were engaged. He proposed at another charity gala, getting down on one knee in front of hundreds of people. The ring was enormous, a diamond so large it felt heavy on her finger. Everyone applauded. Cameras flashed. She said yes with tears in her eyes. Tears that were partly real because she knew her life was about to change forever. Within 6 months, she was walking down the aisle of a cathedral she couldn't have afforded to even visit as a tourist. The wedding was extravagant, covered by society magazines, attended by politicians and celebrities. Her mother sat in the front row, crying, not entirely sure if they were tears of joy or something else. She wore a dress that cost more than her mother's annual salary, and she smiled for the cameras, playing the role of the blushing bride perfectly. She told herself it didn't matter that she didn't love him. He was kind enough, distant but polite. He didn't ask much of her except to be present at his side during events and to live in his home. He didn't demand affection or intimacy with any real passion. Their relationship was more like a business arrangement, which suited her fine. She could pretend. She could play the role of the devoted wife. It was a small price to pay for security. And what a home it was! The Ashford estate sat on 20 acres of perfectly manicured land, surrounded by iron gates and tall hedges that kept the world at bay. The mansion itself was a masterpiece of old-world architecture, built in the late 1800s by Richard's great-grandfather, a railroad baron who had made his fortune in steel and coal. The building was 3 stories of gray stone and leaded glass windows, with towers and turrets that gave it an almost castle-like appearance. The grounds were immaculate, maintained by a team of gardeners who worked year-round to keep the lawns pristine and the flower beds blooming. There was a fountain in the circular drive, a marble sculpture of angels that spouted water from their mouths. There was a greenhouse filled with exotic orchids, a tennis court, a swimming pool that looked like it belonged at a resort. Inside, the mansion was even more impressive. The entry hall was 2 stories high, with a grand staircase that curved upward like something from a movie. The floors were black and white marble, polished to a mirror shine. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceilings, and the walls were covered in silk wallpaper and paintings by artists she recognized from textbooks. There were drawing rooms with fireplaces large enough to stand in, a library with shelves that stretched 2 stories high and held thousands of leather-bound books, a dining room with a table that could seat 30 guests. The furniture was all antique, carefully preserved, worth more than most people's houses. She had her own wing, a suite of rooms that included a bedroom larger than the apartment she had grown up in, a sitting room, a walk-in closet the size of a boutique, and a bathroom with a soaking tub and heated floors. She had her own staff, too, a personal maid who helped her dress and arranged her schedule, a stylist who came weekly to do her hair and makeup, a chef who prepared meals according to her preferences. There was a driver who took her anywhere she wanted to go, though she rarely left the estate in those first few months. She was too overwhelmed, too busy trying to adjust to her new life. For the first time in her life, she didn't worry about money. She didn't check price tags or count coins. She could buy anything she wanted, wear anything she wanted, eat anything she wanted. She had made it. She had escaped. But comfort has a way of revealing cracks. It started small, little things that didn't quite make sense. A maid who wouldn't meet her eyes when she spoke. A gardener who stopped working whenever she walked by, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. The way conversations would stop abruptly when she entered a room, as if the staff had been discussing something they didn't want her to hear. She tried to dismiss it as paranoia, as the natural discomfort of someone who wasn't used to having servants, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger as the weeks went by. And then there was the door at the end of the east wing. It was always locked, a heavy wooden door with an old-fashioned keyhole and no handle, just a brass plate. She had noticed it during her first tour of the house, and when she asked Richard about it, he had waved it off casually. "Just storage," he had said, "old family things, nothing interesting." But something about the way he said it made her curious. She tried the door a few times when she was alone, just to see if it would open, but it never did. She asked the staff about it, but they all gave her the same answer: storage, nothing to worry about. But their eyes would flicker with something, fear or warning, and they would change the subject quickly. Her husband's insistence that certain parts of the house were off limits, not because they were dangerous, but because they were private. He said it with such ease, such confidence, that she didn't question it at first. But as the weeks turned into months, the oddities piled up. There were nights when she woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside her room, slow and deliberate. Yet when she opened the door, no one was there. The hallway would be empty, dimly lit by wall sconces stretching away into shadow. She would stand there in her nightgown, listening, but the house would be silent. She started sleeping with her door locked after that, though she wasn't sure what she was locking out. She would hear faint music coming from somewhere deep in the house, melodies that seemed to drift through the walls like ghosts. Sometimes it was classical, piano or violin. Other times something older, haunting, like a music box winding down. She asked the staff about it once, but they just shook their heads and said they didn't hear anything. But she saw the way they looked at each other, the silent communication that passed between them. They heard it too. They just weren't going to admit it. And then there were the staff themselves. They were polite, professional, always ready to serve, but there was something in their faces when they looked at her. Pity, maybe, or fear. The head butler, Marcus, was especially unnerving. He was tall, thin, with pale skin that looked like it had never seen sunlight, and dark eyes that seemed to see right through her. He had been with the Ashford family for over 20 years, Richard told her, a loyal and trusted employee. But there was something about Marcus that made her skin crawl. He moved through the house like a shadow, always appearing when she least expected it, always watching. She would turn a corner and find him standing there, his hands folded in front of him, his expression blank. She tried to be friendly, to make conversation, but he would only nod and walk away, his footsteps silent on the marble floors. The maids were the same. There were 3 of them, young women who wore identical black dresses and white aprons. They would clean her room while she was out, leave fresh flowers on her nightstand, turn down her bed at night. But they never stayed long enough for her to speak to them. If she entered a room while they were working, they would curtsy and leave immediately, as if they had been trained to avoid her. She started to feel like a ghost in her own house, invisible and alone despite being surrounded by people. She tried to ignore it. She filled her days with shopping trips to expensive boutiques where salespeople fawned over her and helped her select clothes she would never have been able to afford before. She went to spa appointments, got massages and facials and treatments she couldn't pronounce. She attended luncheons with other wealthy wives, women who welcomed her into their circle with air kisses and fake smiles. They would meet at country clubs or fancy restaurants, and they would talk about nothing important. Charity events they were planning, vacations they were taking, complaints about staff or contractors. They asked her how it felt to be the new Mrs. Ashford, and she smiled and said all the right things. But she felt like an imposter among them. They had been born into this world, raised in privilege, taught from birth how to navigate its complexities. She had clawed her way in from the outside, and deep down, she wondered if they could see the difference, if they knew she didn't really belong. But at night, alone in her vast bedroom, the unease crept back in. She would lie awake, staring at the ceiling with its ornate plaster molding, listening to the sounds of the house. The house was too big, too quiet, and yet never truly silent. It breathed, it settled, floorboards creaked, pipes groaned, the wind rattled windows. But there were other sounds too, sounds that didn't belong. Footsteps, whispers, that faint, haunting music. She could feel the house watching her, could feel eyes on her even when she was alone. Sometimes she would get up and walk through the empty hallways, her footsteps echoing on the marble, just to remind herself that she was real, that she was still there. She would stand in front of the locked door in the east wing and stare at it, her hand reaching out to touch the cold wood, wondering what was behind it, why Richard was so adamant that she never go inside. One evening, she asked him about it again. They were sitting in the drawing room, a fire crackling softly in the hearth. Outside, rain pounded against the windows, and the wind howled. Richard was reading a book, a biography of some historical figure she didn't recognize, and she was pretending to flip through a magazine. She had been working up the courage all day, and finally she spoke. "Richard," she said, trying to sound casual, "I was wondering about that locked room in the East Wing. You said it was just storage, but I was thinking maybe we could use the space for something. A home gym, maybe, or an office for me." He looked up, slowly, his expression calm, unreadable. He marked his place in the book with his finger and set it down on the side table. "It's just storage," he said again, his voice patient, as if he were explaining something to a child. "Old family things, nothing interesting." "But surely we could move those things somewhere else," she pressed. "The house is so big, there must be other places to store them." His smile didn't waver, but something flickered in his eyes, something cold. "There's no reason to," he said. "Trust me, darling, it's incredibly dull. Just boxes and dust. You wouldn't be interested." "I'd still like to see it," she said, holding his gaze. The room fell silent, except for the crackle of the fire. Richard studied her for a long moment, and she forced herself not to look away. Finally, he smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps another time," he said. "Right now, I can't find the key. I'll have Marcus look for it." "But you said it was just storage," she said. "Why would you need to look for the key if it's not important?" His smile tightened. "Darling," he said, his voice dropping to a tone she had never heard before, a tone that sent a chill down her spine. "I said, perhaps another time. Please don't push this." She nodded and let it go, but her heart was pounding. The way he had looked at her, the way his voice had changed, it was the first time she had seen a crack in his polite, distant facade. And it terrified her. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about that door, about the way he had dismissed her so smoothly, about the warning in his voice, about the footsteps, about the music, about the staff who wouldn't look at her, about the way Marcus watched her from the shadows. Something was wrong. She knew it in her bones. 3 days later, she made her decision.
She would find out what was behind that door, with or without Richard's permission. She waited until Richard left for a business trip. He traveled often, sometimes for days at a time, flying to meetings in other cities or countries. She never knew exactly where he went or what he did, and she had learned not to ask too many questions. The morning he left, she kissed him goodbye at the front door and watched his car disappear down the long driveway, past the fountain, through the iron gates. Then she turned and walked back inside, her heart already pounding. She had a plan. She had been watching Marcus for weeks, studying his routine.
Every afternoon, at 2 o'clock, he would retreat to his office on the ground floor to go over the household accounts. He would close the door and stay there for at least an hour, sometimes longer. That was when she would make her move. She spent the day pretending everything was normal. She ate breakfast in the sunroom, had lunch on the terrace, took a walk around the grounds. She smiled at the staff when they passed, made small talk with the gardeners, but inside, her mind was racing. At 1:30, she made her way to Marcus's office. The door was closed, and she could hear him inside, talking on the phone in his low, measured voice. She waited until he hung up, then knocked softly. He opened the door, his expression impassive. "Yes, Mrs. Ashford. I was wondering if you could help me with something in the library," she said, giving him her most charming smile. "One of the books fell behind the shelf, and I can't reach it." He hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, madam. Let me just finish up here." "Take your time," she said, and walked away. She went to the library and waited, her heart pounding. A few minutes later, Marcus appeared. She pointed to a spot high on the shelves, and while he climbed the ladder to investigate, she slipped back out into the hallway. She moved quickly, her feet silent on the marble, and went straight to his office. The door was still open. She slipped inside and closed it behind her. His desk was neat, organized, everything in its place. She opened the top drawer and found what she was looking for. A ring of keys, old-fashioned brass keys that looked like they belonged to the mansion's original doors. She grabbed them and slipped them into her pocket, then left the office as quickly as she had entered. She was back in the library before Marcus came down from the ladder. "There's nothing there," he said, looking at her with those dark, unreadable eyes. "Oh, I must have been mistaken," she said, laughing lightly. "Thank you anyway." He nodded and left, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had the keys. Now, she just had to wait. She waited until nightfall. The staff retired early, as they always did, retreating to their quarters on the far side of the estate. The house settled into its eerie quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, oppressive, like the air before a storm. She stayed in her room until she was sure everyone was asleep. Then she got dressed in dark clothes and soft shoes. She moved through the hallways like a shadow, her bare feet soundless on the cold marble. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, but she forced herself to keep moving. She had come too far to turn back now. The hallway to the east wing was long and dimly lit, lined with portraits of Ashford ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow her as she passed. She had walked this hallway before, but never at night, never alone. The paintings looked different in the darkness, their faces twisted and severe, their expressions judgmental. She felt like they were watching her, condemning her for what she was about to do. But she pushed the feeling aside and kept walking. The locked door stood at the very end, tall and made of dark, heavy wood. She pulled out the ring of keys and tried the first one. It didn't fit. She tried the second. Nothing. The third. Still nothing. Her hands were shaking now, and she had to force herself to slow down, to breathe. She tried the fourth key, and it slid into the lock. She turned it. The lock clicked. The door opened. The air inside was stale, cold, and carried a faint metallic scent that made her stomach turn. It smelled like old blood and chemicals, like something dead and preserved. She fumbled for a light switch and found one just inside the door. A single bulb flickered to life overhead, casting weak, yellowish light into the room. It wasn't storage. It wasn't dusty boxes or forgotten furniture. It was something else entirely, something that made her blood run cold. The room was large, maybe 30 feet across, with high ceilings and bare walls. The floor was concrete, stained with dark patches that looked like they had been scrubbed but never quite came clean. The walls were lined with metal shelves, and on those shelves were rows upon rows of files, photographs, and documents, all meticulously organized. In the center of the room was a desk, polished and neat, with a computer and several locked drawers. But it was the photographs that caught her eye first. They were pinned to a large corkboard on the far wall, dozens of them, maybe more. Women, all young, all beautiful, all staring back at her with faces she didn't recognize. Her breath caught in her throat. She stepped closer, her legs feeling weak, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The photos were arranged in rows, each one carefully labeled.
Some were candid shots, taken from a distance, as if the subjects didn't know they were being photographed. Others were more formal, like portraits or wedding photos. Beneath each photo was a name, a date, and a series of notes written in Richard's handwriting. She recognized the neat, looping script from the notes he left her around the house, little reminders about dinner parties and social events. Her heart hammered in her chest as she read. Emily Dawson, age 24, married March 2012, disappeared June 2013. Notes: compliant, no family, easy disposal. Sophia Lennox, age 27, married September 2014, disappeared January 2016. Notes: suspicious, required additional measures. Body disposed in northeast quadrant. Caroline Frost, age 29, married April 2017, disappeared November 2018. Notes: cooperative until end, clean execution. The list went on and on. There were at least a dozen names, maybe more, each one with clinical, detached notes describing their deaths. All wives, all gone. And at the very end of the board, pinned in the corner with a red thumbtack, was a photo of her wedding photo, her name beneath it, her wedding date, and beneath that, blank space, waiting to be filled in. She staggered backward, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream that was building in her throat. This couldn't be real. It couldn't. But the evidence was right in front of her, cold and undeniable. Richard hadn't married her for companionship. He hadn't married her because he was lonely or because he wanted a partner. He had married her because it was part of a pattern, a cycle that had been repeating for decades. He was a serial killer, and she was next in line. Her mind raced, panic flooding through her system. She had to get out. She had to run. But where? She had no money of her own, no car, no phone that wasn't monitored by Richard's people. He controlled everything. She had signed a prenup that left her with nothing if she left the marriage. She was trapped in this house, in this life, with a man who was planning to kill her, completely and utterly trapped. No, she forced herself to breathe, to think clearly despite the terror coursing through her veins. There had to be a way out. There had to be evidence she could use. She turned back to the desk and began searching through the drawers, pulling them open with trembling hands. Most were locked, but one opened easily. Inside were more files, more documents, financial records.
Bank statements showing large deposits and transfers to offshore accounts. Insurance policies on each of the wives, policies that paid out to Richard upon their deaths. And then she found it, buried beneath a stack of papers, a ledger, a detailed accounting of everything, dates and payments and methods of disposal. Her blood ran cold as she read through it. Richard wasn't just killing these women, he was profiting from it. Insurance payouts, inheritance claims, fraudulent transfers of their assets. He would marry them, isolate them, make sure they had no one to miss them, then kill them and take everything. He was methodical, calculated, and he had been doing this for years, maybe decades. She pulled out her phone, the one Richard had given her when they got married, and started taking pictures. She photographed everything: the corkboard with the photos and names, the ledger with its detailed accounting, the files with financial records and insurance policies. She needed proof. She needed evidence that would put him away forever. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone steady, but she forced herself to keep going. She photographed every page, every document, every piece of evidence she could find. She had to document it all. She was so focused on photographing the evidence that she almost didn't hear it. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. Her entire body went rigid, frozen with terror. Someone was coming. She shoved the ledger back into the drawer and turned off the light, plunging the room into darkness. She pressed herself against the wall behind the door, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then they stopped right outside the door. She could hear breathing on the other side, slow and measured. The door handle turned. The door creaked open. A figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway. It wasn't Richard. It was Marcus. He stood there for a long moment, perfectly still, his eyes scanning the darkness. Then he spoke, his voice low and cold, devoid of any emotion. "I know you're in here, Mrs. Ashford. There's no point in hiding." She didn't move, didn't breathe. Every muscle in her body was coiled tight, ready to run. Marcus took a step forward, his hand reaching for the light switch. But before he could flip it, before he could see her, she bolted. She shoved past him with all the strength she had, using the element of surprise to her advantage. Her shoulder connected with his chest, sending him stumbling backward into the doorframe with a grunt of surprise. She didn't look back. She just ran. She ran down the hallway, her feet pounding on the marble floor, the sound echoing through the empty house. Behind her, she could hear Marcus shouting, his voice raised in alarm for the first time since she had known him. His shouts echoed through the mansion, and within seconds she heard other voices joining his. The staff, they were all in on it. All of them had known what Richard was doing, had helped him hide it, had been complicit in the murders of all those women. And now they were coming for her. She reached the grand staircase and took the steps 2 at a time, her nightgown billowing around her legs, threatening to trip her. She could hear multiple sets of footsteps now, coming from different directions, closing in on her from all sides. They had spread out through the house, cutting off her escape routes. She had to get to the front door. It was her only chance. She burst into the entry hall and ran for the massive wooden doors. She grabbed the handle and pulled, but it didn't budge. Locked. Of course it was locked. She fumbled with the deadbolt, her fingers slipping on the cold metal, and finally got it open. She yanked the door open and burst out into the cold night air. The gravel driveway cut into her bare feet, sharp and painful, but she didn't care. She just ran. She ran as fast as she could, her lungs burning, her legs aching, her whole body screaming at her to stop, but she couldn't. If she stopped, they would catch her. If they caught her, she would die. She could hear them behind her, their footsteps crunching on the gravel, their voices calling out. Marcus was shouting orders, coordinating the staff like a military operation. She ran past the fountain, past the perfectly manicured flower beds, toward the iron gates at the end of the driveway. The gates loomed ahead, tall and imposing, wrought iron twisted into elaborate patterns. They were closed, locked. She screamed in frustration, her voice raw and desperate, and looked around wildly for another way out. The hedges, the tall hedges that surrounded the property. She could climb them. She had to climb them. She veered off the driveway and ran across the lawn, her feet slipping on the wet grass. The hedges were 8 feet tall, thick and dense, with branches that scratched and tore at her skin. But she didn't care about the pain. She grabbed onto the branches and started climbing, hauling herself up inch by inch. Thorns tore into her hands and arms, ripping through the thin fabric of her nightgown, drawing blood. She could feel the warm trickle of blood running down her arms, but she kept climbing. She had to get over. She had to get away. She reached the top and threw herself over, landing hard on the other side. Pain shot through her ankle as it twisted beneath her, but she forced herself to stand. She could hear them on the other side of the hedge, cursing, trying to figure out where she had gone. She limped away from the estate, moving as fast as her injured ankle would allow. She had to get to the road. She had to find help. She stumbled through the darkness, the trees and bushes tearing at her clothes and skin. Her nightgown was in tatters now, hanging off her in shreds, soaked with blood and mud. She could barely see where she was going, but she kept moving forward, driven by pure survival instinct. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she saw lights ahead, the main road. She burst out of the trees and onto the pavement, waving her arms frantically at the first car she saw. An older woman pulled over, her face filled with shock and concern as she took in the sight of the bloodied, desperate woman standing in the middle of the road. The woman jumped out of her car and rushed over. "Oh my God, are you okay? What happened?" She tried to speak, but her throat was raw, her voice barely more than a whisper. She gasped for breath, her whole body shaking with adrenaline and fear. "Please," she managed to croak out, "call the police. Please, he's going to kill me." The woman didn't hesitate. She pulled out her phone and dialed, speaking quickly and urgently to the dispatcher. Within minutes, sirens filled the night, the sound of multiple police cars racing down the dark road. They arrived in a blaze of flashing lights and screeching tires, officers jumping out with their weapons drawn. She told them everything, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. The locked room, the photographs, the ledger, the bodies, the staff chasing her. At first, they looked skeptical, like they thought she might be insane or on drugs. But something in her face, in her desperation, must have convinced them. They radioed for backup and headed toward the Ashford estate with their lights and sirens blazing. The police arrived at the estate with a warrant and a team of investigators. What they found inside that locked room confirmed everything she had told them. The photographs of all the dead women, the detailed ledger documenting the murders, the files with insurance policies and fraudulent financial transactions. They searched the grounds with dogs and ground-penetrating radar, working through the night and into the next day.
The bodies of 3 women were discovered buried on the property, hidden in unmarked graves in a wooded area near the edge of the estate, a section that was never maintained and rarely visited. The remains were badly decomposed, but forensic teams were able to identify them through dental records and DNA analysis. Emily Dawson, Sophia Lennox, Caroline Frost. All of them had been reported missing years ago, but the cases had gone cold. The authorities had assumed they had simply left their wealthy husbands and started new lives elsewhere, maybe moved to another country. No one had suspected Richard. He was too powerful, too respectable, too connected. No one had thought to look in his backyard. Richard Ashford was arrested at the airport 12 hours later, trying to flee the country with a fake passport, several $1 million in cash stuffed into briefcases, and a one-way ticket to a country with no extradition treaty. Marcus and 2 other staff members were taken into custody as accomplices. The investigation revealed that Marcus had been with Richard for over 20 years, helping him carry out his crimes, dispose of bodies, forge documents, and maintain the elaborate charade. He had been there from the beginning, loyal and devoted, more than just a butler. He was Richard's right hand, his partner in murder. The other staff members had been complicit to varying degrees. Some had known about the murders and helped cover them up out of fear or greed. Others had suspected something was wrong, but had looked the other way, too afraid to speak up, too dependent on their jobs to risk losing them. The media exploded. The story dominated headlines for weeks, maybe months. It was everywhere, on every news channel, in every newspaper, all over social media. The millionaire who had charmed high society, who had donated millions to charities and hosted elegant parties attended by senators and celebrities, was revealed to be a monster.
A serial killer who had been operating for decades right under everyone's noses. Investigative journalists dug into his past and discovered that his first wife, a woman named Margaret, had also disappeared under mysterious circumstances 30 years earlier. Her body was never found, but now authorities believed she was likely the first victim, the one where Richard had perfected his method. They found records of 2 other wives before Margaret, women who had died in what were ruled accidents at the time, a car crash, a fall down the stairs. But now, with everything else that had been discovered, those deaths were being investigated as possible murders too. Richard had been killing for most of his adult life, refining his technique, getting better at it with each victim. And she, the woman who had married him for money, the gold digger who had been scorned by society wives and dismissed by the tabloids, became the one who brought him down. She became a hero overnight, though she never felt like one. She testified at the trial, sitting in the witness box for hours, her voice steady despite the nightmares that still haunted her every night. She told the court everything: the locked room with its wall of photographs, the ledger with its clinical documentation of murder, the way the staff had chased her through the mansion, the truth about the man everyone had thought they knew. The defense tried to paint her as a gold digger who had fabricated evidence out of spite, a jilted wife seeking revenge. They suggested she had planted the evidence herself, that she was lying to get her hands on Richard's fortune. But the physical evidence was overwhelming. The bodies buried on the property, the financial records showing the insurance payouts and fraudulent transfers, the testimonies of the staff members who had turned state's evidence in exchange for reduced sentences. There was no way to deny it, no way to spin it. Richard Ashford was guilty, and everyone knew it. Richard was convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder, fraud, conspiracy, and a dozen other charges. The trial lasted 3 months, and every day the courtroom was packed with journalists, spectators, and family members of the victims. When the verdict was read, there was a collective gasp, then applause, then weeping from the families who had waited years for justice. Richard showed no emotion. He sat at the defense table in his expensive suit, his face blank, as if he were attending a board meeting rather than his own murder trial. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Marcus received 30 years for his role as an accomplice. The other staff members received lesser sentences, ranging from 5 to 15 years, depending on their level of involvement. The estate was seized by the government, the assets frozen pending civil lawsuits from the victims' families. Everything Richard had built, all his wealth and property, was torn apart and divided up. The mansion itself became a crime scene, then later a curiosity, and eventually it was sold at auction for a fraction of its worth. No one wanted to live in a house where so many women had been murdered. It carried a stain that no amount of money could wash away. She walked away from it all with nothing but her life. The prenuptial agreement she had signed meant she had no claim to any of Richard's assets, and even if she had, she wouldn't have wanted them. That money was tainted, built on the bodies of innocent women. She testified at the civil trials too, helping the victims' families get some measure of compensation, though no amount of money could bring back their daughters, their sisters, their mothers. And for the first time in her life, that felt like enough. She had her life. She had survived. And that was more valuable than all of Richard's millions. But survival came with a price. The media attention was relentless. Reporters camped outside whatever hotel she was staying in, shouting questions, shoving cameras in her face. Tabloids published wild stories about her, some painting her as a hero, others suggesting she had known all along and was complicit. Her face was everywhere. She couldn't go anywhere without being recognized, without people staring and whispering. The other wives from Richard's social circle, the women who had welcomed her into their lunches and charity events, now avoided her completely. They treated her survival as if it were somehow distasteful, a reminder of how close they all were to danger, how their perfect world wasn't as safe as they pretended. They didn't want to be associated with scandal. They didn't want to think about what it meant that a monster had been among them all along. She tried to go back to her mother's apartment, but the reporters found her there too. They harassed her mother, asking invasive questions, offering money for interviews. Her mother, who had never been comfortable with the marriage in the first place, now looked at her with a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that she was alive, sadness for everything she had been through. They sat together in the tiny kitchen where she had grown up, drinking tea, not saying much. What was there to say? She had married for money and nearly died for it. She had gotten everything she thought she wanted and lost herself in the process. After a few weeks, she couldn't take it anymore. The constant attention, the stares, the whispers, the way people looked at her with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. She needed to disappear. She needed to start over, somewhere where no one knew her name or her face. She withdrew the small amount of money she had in her personal account, money she had saved from working before the marriage, and bought a bus ticket. She didn't even know where she was going. She just picked a destination that was far away, a small town on the coast that she had never heard of. She changed her appearance, cutting her hair short and dyeing it a different color. She bought cheap clothes from thrift stores, the kind of clothes she used to wear before Richard. She changed her name legally, going through the process at a courthouse in a city where no one knew her. She picked something simple and forgettable,
Sarah Miller. It was generic, anonymous, exactly what she needed. She arrived in the coastal town on a gray morning in late autumn. The air smelled like salt and seaweed, and the sound of waves was constant, a rhythmic crashing that never stopped. She rented a tiny apartment above a bakery, a studio with peeling paint and a view of the water. It was nothing like the mansion. It was small and shabby, and the pipes rattled and the heating didn't work properly. But it was hers. She had chosen it. She had paid for it with her own money, and no one there knew who she was or what she had been through. She got a job at a local bookstore, a small, independent shop that smelled like old paper and coffee. The owner was an older woman named Dorothy who asked no questions and seemed content to have an extra pair of hands. The work was simple, quiet. She shelved books, helped customers, worked the register. It was a far cry from the life she had lived as Mrs. Ashford, attending galas and charity events, wearing designer clothes, being photographed for society pages. But she found a strange peace in the simplicity of it. She liked the routine, the predictability, the way each day was the same as the last. She liked being anonymous, just another employee in a small bookstore, unremarkable and unnoticed. She slowly began to rebuild her life, piece by piece. She made friends, cautiously at first, testing the waters to see if she could trust again. There was Maria, a waitress at the diner down the street, who made her laugh with dirty jokes and stories about terrible customers. There was Tom, an old fisherman who came into the bookstore every week to buy mystery novels, who treated her with a grandfatherly kindness that made her feel safe. There was Dorothy herself, who never pried, but always seemed to know when she was having a bad day, who would make her tea and let her take her breaks in the back room when the world felt like too much. She went to therapy, finding a counselor in the next town over, where she felt comfortable opening up. She worked through the trauma, the guilt, the fear that had taken root deep in her soul. She talked about the nightmares that still plagued her, the way she would wake up in the middle of the night convinced that Marcus was standing at the foot of her bed, or that Richard had found her and was coming to finish what he started. She talked about the guilt she felt for marrying him in the first place, for being so desperate for money that she had ignored all the warning signs, all the red flags. Her therapist helped her understand that she was a victim, not a perpetrator, that she had been manipulated and trapped by a man who was very good at what he did. It took months, maybe years, but slowly the nightmares began to fade. Slowly, she began to feel like a person again, instead of just a survivor. The nightmares never fully disappeared, though. She would still wake sometimes in the middle of the night, her heart pounding, the sheets soaked with sweat. She would lie there in the darkness, listening to the sound of the waves outside her window, reminding herself that she was safe, that the door was locked, that Richard was in prison and would never get out, that Marcus was in prison too, that she was far away from that house, from that life. She had installed 3 deadbolts and a chain on her door, and she checked them every night before bed, sometimes twice. She kept a baseball bat by her nightstand and pepper spray in her purse. She took self-defense classes at the community center, learning how to fight back, how to protect herself. She would never be vulnerable again. She would never let anyone have that much power over her again. Years passed. The story faded from the headlines, replaced by newer scandals, fresher tragedies. People moved on. The world forgot about the Ashford murders, or at least stopped talking about them. She was grateful for that. She wanted to be forgotten. She wanted to disappear into her quiet life and never be noticed again. One day, a journalist tracked her down. She never knew how he found her. Maybe he had connections, maybe he had hired a private investigator, maybe he had just gotten lucky. He showed up at the bookstore, a young man in his 30s with a notebook and a determined look on his face. He asked if he could speak with her, said he was writing a book about the Ashford case, said he wanted to include her perspective. She said no. He persisted, showing up day after day, waiting outside the bookstore when her shift ended, following her at a distance. She told Dorothy, who threatened to call the police if he didn't leave her alone. He backed off for a while, but then he started sending letters to her apartment, asking for just one interview, offering her money for her story. Finally, she agreed to meet him, just to make him go away. They met at a coffee shop on the edge of town, a place where she knew she wouldn't run into anyone she knew. He sat across from her with his notebook open, his pen ready, his eyes bright with the hunger of someone chasing a big story. He asked her the questions she had been dreading. Did she regret marrying Richard? Did she blame herself for what happened? How did it feel to be married to a serial killer? Did she have nightmares? Had she ever suspected? She thought about each question carefully before answering. She told him that she had made a choice born out of desperation and fear and a deep, abiding hunger for security. She had wanted money. She had wanted to escape the poverty that had defined her entire life. She had thought that marrying Richard would solve all her problems, that wealth would make her happy, that security was the same thing as safety. But in the end, what she had gained was something far more valuable than money: her freedom, her life,
and the knowledge that she was stronger than she ever thought possible. The journalist asked her if she would do it again, if she could go back in time and make a different choice. She shook her head slowly. She told him that money was easy to lose, but life was precious. She had learned that the hard way. She had learned that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. That some choices, once made, can never be undone. She told him that the scariest things in life are not always the monsters in the shadows, but the decisions we make when we're desperate, when we're afraid, when we think we have no other options. She finished her coffee and stood up to leave. The journalist asked if he could use her story in his book. She thought about it for a moment, then shook her head. She told him that her story wasn't his to tell. It was hers, and she had already lived it. She didn't need to relive it again in the pages of a book that strangers would read for entertainment. She walked out of the coffee shop and never saw the journalist again. The book was eventually published without her cooperation, and she never read it. She heard it became a bestseller, that it was optioned for a movie, that people were fascinated by the story of the millionaire serial killer and the wife who bought away. But she didn't care. That chapter of her life was closed. She had moved on. She continued her quiet life in the small coastal town. She worked at the bookstore, walked on the beach, attended community events. She volunteered at a women's shelter, helping others who had escaped abusive relationships. She didn't tell them her story, but they seemed to sense that she understood what they were going through. She listened to them, supported them, reminded them that they were strong enough to rebuild, that survival was just the beginning, not the end, that there was life after trauma, happiness after horror. One afternoon, while she was walking along the beach, she met a man. He was a fisherman, weathered and kind, with laugh lines around his eyes and calloused hands that spoke of years of hard work. His name was David. They started talking, just casual conversation about the weather and the fishing and how the town had changed over the years. He made her laugh, really laugh, for the first time in what felt like forever. It was a genuine laugh, not forced or polite, but real and spontaneous. They started running into each other regularly, at the market, at the diner, on the beach. Eventually, they started seeing each other intentionally, going for walks, having dinner, sitting together watching the sunset. She was honest with him from the start. She told him she had been married before, that it had ended badly, that she wasn't ready for anything serious. He nodded and said that was okay. He wasn't in a rush. He had been married before too, lost his wife to cancer 5 years earlier, and he understood that healing takes time. They took their time, building trust brick by brick, learning each other's stories without rushing or pushing. He didn't ask invasive questions. He didn't demand to know everything about her past. He just accepted her as she was, scars and all. Eventually, she told him everything. They were sitting on his boat, watching the sun sink into the ocean, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. The words just came out, tumbling forth after years of being held back. She told him about growing up poor, about marrying Richard for money, about the mansion and the locked room and the photographs and the bodies. She told him about running through the night, bleeding and terrified, about the trial and the media circus and the years of therapy. She told him about the nightmares that still woke her up sometimes, about the fear that never quite went away. She waited for him to pull back, to look at her with fear or disgust or pity, but he didn't. He just took her hand and held it, his thumb gently rubbing circles on her palm, and he told her she was the bravest person he had ever met, and for the first time, she believed it. They were married 2 years later, a small ceremony on the beach with just a few close friends. No grand cathedral, no designer dress, no cameras or society pages, just the two of them and the people who mattered, standing barefoot in the sand while the waves crashed behind them. She wore a simple white dress she had bought from a local boutique, and she carried wildflowers that David had picked that morning. Dorothy was there, and Maria and Tom, and a handful of David's fishing buddies. It was perfect. It was real. It was hers. The ceremony was short and sweet, and when the officiant pronounced them married, she kissed David and felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope, joy, peace. She never forgot what happened at the Ashford estate. The memories were always there, lurking in the back of her mind like shadows that never quite disappeared. But they no longer controlled her. She had reclaimed her life, her story, her identity. She was no longer the girl who had married for money, or the woman who had nearly become another victim. She was simply herself. A woman named Sarah who worked in a bookstore and was married to a fisherman and volunteered at a women's shelter. A woman who had survived something terrible and come out the other side. A woman who was scarred but whole, broken but healing. She and David built a life together, a simple life that revolved around routine and small pleasures. Morning coffee on the porch, evening walks on the beach, weekends spent fixing up their little house. They adopted a dog, a scruffy mutt from the shelter who had been abused and abandoned, but was learning to trust again. She saw herself in that dog, in the way it would flinch at sudden movements, but slowly, gradually, learned to accept love and affection. They named him Charlie, and he became a constant companion, following her everywhere, sleeping at the foot of their bed. Sometimes, late at night, when David was asleep and the house was quiet except for Charlie's soft snoring, she would lie awake and think about the other women. Emily and Sophia and Caroline and all the others whose names had been pinned to that corkboard. She would think about their families, their friends, the people who had loved them and lost them. She would think about how close she had come to joining them, to becoming another name on Richard's list, another body buried in an unmarked grave. And she would feel a profound gratitude for her life, for every breath, for every sunrise, for every moment she got to spend with David and Charlie and her friends. She had been given a second chance, and she was determined not to waste it. The town eventually learned who she really was.
It was inevitable in a small community where everyone knew everyone else's business. Someone recognized her from old news footage, or maybe they Googled her name and found the articles. Word spread quickly. For a few weeks, she was the subject of gossip and whispers again. People stared at her in the grocery store, pointed her out to their friends. But then, something surprising happened. Instead of treating her like a curiosity or a scandal, the community rallied around her. They respected her privacy. They protected her from outsiders who came looking for the woman who had survived the Ashford murders. When journalists showed up asking questions, the townspeople stonewalled them, claiming they had never heard of anyone by that name. The local paper ran a brief editorial about respecting survivors and giving people the space to heal. And gradually, the attention died down again. She became just Sarah again, the woman who worked at the bookstore, nothing more. Years turned into decades. She and David grew older together, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing down. They moved into a smaller house right on the beach, a cottage with a big porch where they could sit and watch the waves. She eventually retired from the bookstore, and Dorothy gave her a party with cake and speeches about what a valued employee she had been. She spent her days reading, gardening, taking long walks with Charlie, and then, eventually, with Charlie's successor after he passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 14. She stayed in touch with some of the victims' families. She had testified at the civil trials and had formed bonds with several of them. They would exchange cards at holidays, occasional phone calls, messages of support and solidarity. They were united by tragedy, but also by survival, by the determination to keep living despite what Richard had taken from them. One of the families started a foundation in their daughter's name, providing support and resources to domestic violence survivors. She donated to it regularly and sometimes volunteered, speaking to groups of women about her experience, about how she had escaped and rebuilt her life. Richard died in prison when she was in her early 50s. He had served just over 20 years of his life sentence when he suffered a massive heart attack and died in the prison infirmary. The news made headlines for a day or two, a brief resurgence of interest in the case, but it faded quickly. She didn't feel anything when she heard the news. Not relief, not satisfaction, not closure. Just a dull acknowledgement that it was over, that he was finally gone. She had long since stopped giving him power over her emotions. His death changed nothing about her life. She was already free. Marcus was released from prison a few years later, having served his full sentence. She heard through her therapist, who had kept tabs on the case, that he had moved to another state and was living quietly under a new identity. She hoped she would never see him again, and she never did. She had nightmares about him for a few weeks after his release, but they eventually subsided. He was an old man now, powerless, just another ex-convict trying to survive in a world that had moved on without him. She lived to see her 70th birthday, then her 75th, surrounded by people who loved her. David was still by her side, more patient and kind with each passing year. They had never had children, but they had built a family out of friends and community, out of the connections they had forged over decades of living in the same place. She had learned that family wasn't just blood. It was the people who showed up for you, who supported you, who loved you despite knowing all your broken pieces. On her 80th birthday, her friends threw her a party on the beach. There was a bonfire and music and laughter, and she sat in a chair surrounded by people, feeling grateful and content. Someone asked her what the secret to a long life was, and she thought about it for a long moment before answering. She said that the secret was simple. Keep living. Keep getting up every morning. Keep choosing life, even when it's hard, even when it hurts, even when you're scared. Because life is precious,
and every day is a gift, and survival is only the beginning. What matters is what you do with the life you've been given. She looked out at the ocean, at the waves that never stopped rolling in, constant and eternal. She thought about the girl she had been, desperate and scared and willing to do anything to escape poverty. She thought about the woman she had become, scarred but strong, broken but whole. And she realized that her greatest triumph wasn't surviving Richard Ashford. It was learning to live again afterward. It was choosing hope over fear, trust over suspicion, love over loneliness. That was the real victory. That was what it meant to be free. The mansion, the wealth, the man who had tried to make her another name on his list, all of it was behind her now, faded into history, reduced to a cautionary tale that people told to remind themselves that monsters can hide behind any mask. And she would never look back. She had learned that the scariest things are not always hidden in locked rooms or buried in unmarked graves. Sometimes the scariest thing is the choice to trust when you've been betrayed, to love when you've been hurt, to hope when you've been broken. But making that choice over and over again was what made life worth living. And she had lived.
She had survived. And that was enough.